Welcome to the PIPC room, and my name is Jason Wang, and our first breakaway topic for today is usage, quality, and access to payments, a fintech view. To lead our discussions, our moderator is Rufeda Hamilton, Head of Payments for Standard Bank, and joining her is Andrew Marsh, co-founder, MD of Efficacy Payment, and Gerard Oosthuizen, Chief Technology Officer at Intersect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. We live in a turbulent world. The last 4 days, testimony to that, and very sobering. I wanted to take today as an opportunity to put a positive spin on turbulence. Turbulence in payments, turbulence for me as a banker in payments, and talk about the change that we are seeing that is causing us to radically and candidly transform the way we do things, change the way we've looked at things, and look differently at the partners that we will collaborate with going forward. So, a banker and two fintechs. What can go wrong? Just by show of hands, how many bankers are there in the room? And how many standard bankers are there in the room? Well, shout out to you. And how many fintechs are there in the room? Okay. Wow. How many of you know what the other one's thinking? None. Okay, so today's going to prove very useful for all of us. So when I was asked to facilitate a conversation with two stalwarts in the country, and they're going to introduce themselves just now, I found it challenging to think about what is a banker like myself who spends most of my day job marveling at how to make your payments seamless, effortless, real-time, I think cost-effective and free from the early morning presentations today, and then safe. That keeps me awake at night. And I thought, but they do it so effortlessly. Their ingenuity is astonishing, and their pace of technology and the way they embrace it is remarkable. Not that we haven't done that as bankers, and yet I think there's such opportunity to treat collaboration as key in this broader ecosystem that we operate in for the benefit of our clients and the ordinary African and South African out there. So in the spirit of disruption, I thought we would change up the conventional panel, and we're actually having today a very useful presidential-style debate, two contenders, not necessarily opponents, occasional banker insights, and your inputs, comments, and questions as well if we get to them. Before that, though, the world of fintech is remarkably confusing for someone like myself who's taken 23 years just to learn payments, and then you blink and you've got to deal with a whole other plethora of participants in this space. So I thought we'd start with a little bit of a package that I put together, capturing some of my thoughts, some of our team thoughts, to give you a sense of where we've come from, and that would lead us into this, for me, quite, I think, radically changeable debate that we're going into. So I'm going to cue the video, if we can start playing, and please keep your questions going. Thank you. Okay, so to kick us off, I thought, and you saw that in the video, when I tried to grapple with everything I heard yesterday, and then this rapid pace of technology, where's the heart of what's embracing that technology or reflecting it? The poster child, ChatGPT, generative AI. And you would have seen in that video that I actually typed it in, what is a payment fintech? Because I'm still not 100% sure, and that's what we're going to solve for today, is where do we look for that payment inspiration, and how are we changing the world? So let me just quickly tell you about the debate. We're running quickly out of time. But for the next 40 minutes, you're going to hear Gerard and Andrew. They're going to quickly introduce themselves now. Take 3 minutes for every question that I'm going to put up, and they're going to give you a view, opposing or otherwise, and it could be 3 minutes, it could be less, and then they're going to each have an opportunity to rebut the views that they're hearing. So all exciting, we're ready to go. I'm going to hand over quickly for them to say, just say hello and introduce themselves.
Thanks for that introduction, Rufeda. Hi, everyone. As you've heard, Gerard Oosthuizen, CTO at Intersect, 25 years in payments, and excited to share a bit of a fintech perspective with you. My main focus these days is focusing on where the world's going in terms of global trends, trying to make sure that we can find some innovation in that and solve real problems, and not just make up new problems, but hopefully make things better.
Good morning, everybody. Andrew Marsh, Managing Director of Efficacy Payments and also Head of Financial Services in the Kilo Group. In terms of the main business that I'm responsible for, or we co-founded in terms of Efficacy Payments, the whole business has been built on the need to really solve the financial inclusion, cash displacement issue that we've got in South Africa, and we'll allude to a little bit more of that when we work through today. But I think I'm in a fortunate position, having sat on both sides of the fence, started my career in terms of growing up in the banks, and so I got a good perspective from there, and then obviously worked through the PSOs, and then ended up in this wonderful place called FinTech.
So you're a reformed banker, right?
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so also for complete transparency, the questions you see have been completely generated on ChatGPT. I was astonished. They're actually pretty good, but I'm keen to get your views. But here's our first question. Okay, Gerard, we're going to first toss a coin in true presidential style to see who goes first. And while we're doing that, I'm going to reflect on the question.
Go for it. Heads.
Okay, Gerard goes first. So our first question, you can see up on the screen. I'm going to let Gerard go, and our timer starts now. So he has 3 minutes.
Great. Okay, so with that pressure on me, multiple clocks going. I think the first thing probably to reflect is that ChatGPT uses the internet and the sentiment of the internet, and I have a problem. Firstly, ChatGPT is way too verbose for me, so I have to read these things about 10 times. But the other thing, of course, is it presents this opposing view. Fintech companies, are they the force that's going to come and save banks? And I perhaps thought I'd start with the history. I started 25 years ago in a fintech at that stage, and we actually sold our software to banks. Right, so we're not a fintech that we're competing with the banks. We built a payment switch on Windows, right, server in 1997. That was completely disruptive. That was really high risk. And we sold that to the banks, and the banks were innovative and forward-looking enough to actually adopt that and use that. So fintechs don't always compete with banks. Fintechs help banks out and enable them. So in my view, I see 4 types of fintechs in the market today. So the first type of fintech is us. We're technology suppliers and providers, enablers to bank. We identify a problem, we identify a weakness, an opportunity, and we find the right people in the bank that's innovative enough with us to take that leap of faith. The second type, of course, is the big ones we all know about, right? The larger organizations that have a technology capability and bring that into the fintech space. Here we have, I guess, 3 main categories. The one would be the MNOs, that seems to be what the banks fear. And then we have, of course, retailers, that's on the other side of the fence and has salivated at this opportunity, and they have the data to engage with the client. And then, of course, we have the social media giants, right, that have got an angle in. And lastly, the mobile operating system vendors that are, I mean, there's only really two of these large players, and they largely play in these other spaces. But that's the second category. I think then you get the classic, well-known fintechs, the disruptive ones that comes up with a new brand, the M-Pesas and the like, that comes and changes things. And a lot of times, they also don't necessarily compete with the banks. If it's a great merchant fintech or an enabler like Stripe or Shopify, they're actually going to make the bank more money because there's more transactions flowing, there's more enablement. So sometimes they also help the banks. So I think there's a number of people that play in fintechs. And then lastly, I want to add fintech into banks. Some banks are real innovative in fintechs, and they collaborate. So ultimately, I think there's a partnership, there's collaboration. The world is moving towards a place where we can transform. And in all of the cases where we ran our software, we had to go through certification. We had to go through all of the rigors. We had to meet all the compliance. Now, not only does the executives of bank get audited, all of our staff gets checked for compliance and for regulation.
Okay, right. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, so the world of fintech, I think it needs to be unpacked. There's so many facets to the name and what it means and what it represents to different people. It's definitely a transformative force that is out there, and I think it is something that needs to be respected. And you know, if you think about fintech, it's probably really been around since around about 2010, 2011, when we started seeing the proliferation of fintech companies coming through, driven on a global scale, and then starting to penetrate into different geographies around the world. My view is that fintechs accelerate innovation into the market, which ultimately drives growth. It increases financial inclusion and ultimately improves access to payments. And it's not just limited to payments, but typically the fintechs are what drives the thinking in the market. It might even drive some of the nuances around risks and potentially threats in the market that need to be taken into account. But those type of things actually get highlighted by fintechs coming into the ecosystem and potentially even making mistakes in that process. So they're not perfect. Disruption will always be there, and I think that's something we've got to take into account. If you're a bank and sitting on the banking side of the fence, there's always disruption that comes from your competitors, and you've got a choice: do you react to that or don't you? I think the benefits of fintech is, yes, there can be disruptors in the market, but as a bank, you're actually in a fortunate position if a fintech, call it disrupting the ecosystem, because you've got the opportunity to partner with a fintech. And that partnership with the disruptor ultimately allows you as a bank to control those economics or at least participate in those economics. Obviously, if your competitors are being the disruptor, there's no chance in playing within those economics. Then just in terms of our world and the world that I operate, we've got a very simple philosophy. When we structure the business and sort of the philosophy that we live by is that we work within the regulatory framework that's provided within the market. We provide interoperable solutions, so that's a mantra that we live by. And then we also stand to work alongside the banks, work alongside retailers, the MNOs, and other fintechs. And we very much see and very much driven by a partnership and an enablement type strategy, as opposed to trying to own everything and drive everything ourselves. And I think that's also where the mind shift needs to take place is, you know, we're living in an ever increasing competitive and complex world. And it's really a case of how do you actually embrace what is happening as opposed to trying to drive everything yourself. Then lastly, in terms of the risks, these can largely be managed. I mean, we all have to work within a regulatory framework. There's a large degree of guidance out there that is available to assist working in an accountable environment. You've got things like the Deposit Taking Act, being an accountable institution, all these kind of factors that come into play that largely regulates what a fintech can do in the market.
Andrew, I'm going to stop you there. Okay, we've got 30 minutes to rebut, and if you need to. And can you talk to risk a bit more, Gerard? Like,
Yeah,
Do you get an easier ride than bankers do
I
in
think
risk management?
for us in the category of risk, I think we're perhaps even more disadvantaged to a bank. A bank can take his idea and run. We first have to get it through 10 people in the bank. And a lot of times people that join us think for the first time, oh, I've had a good meeting with the bank, this deal is going to go. No, there are 15, 20 people in the bank. Anyone can say no. If you get all freaking 15 of them aligned, otherwise nothing happens. And what if you don't find that jockey, that interested party in it? So I think there's such a lot of protection built in for us as vendor space. I think that's there. I think to the other side, obviously somebody letting loose and just letting fly, causing chaos, not taking it. I think that's where the fintechs are very open to playing in a responsible way. And I think we need to find a way where we can grow at scale. You're going to stop me now, but I'll try to get it in anyway. In Africa, there's a number of people that started by giving loan extensions to merchants, and they didn't just give them a big loan. They offered them a payment service, and they saw their volumes of payment. They understood their business, and then they gave them increasingly more responsive and more credit. And I think that's the way in which we can do this. We can manage in an incremental way to make sure we don't disrupt too much.
Okay, Andrew?
Yeah, just a one-liner, and that's literally, we've ultimately all got to play by the same rules. And as a fintech, you're typically very reliant on the bank and on the current incumbents in the market to actually enable and empower your solutions. And so those rules are pretty standard across all players.
Okay. Look, honestly, sometimes it doesn't feel that way, but I really appreciate your insights. I mean, you don't have to dress up for your day most days, so it feels like you're getting an easier ride.
We did dress up today.
Okay.
We're in really
Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on to our next question. I do see the questions coming through. We're going to try and get to them. I'm not going to read it out, so I'm going to let Gerard go in the interest of time. Sorry.
Yeah.
Andrew, go.
I just want to be fair.
You want to be fair.
Yeah, I'd argue that fintechs serve as essential innovators in the market as opposed to disruptors. They largely identify gaps and valuable alternatives in the market to what the typical incumbent solutions might be. I think there's numerous examples in the South African context where fintechs have actually driven the industry on. And just to name a couple of those, I mean, you'll be familiar with these players, but if you look what Yoko and Ikorka have done in the POS acquiring space to really put down, and it's not even low-cost acceptance because we don't even have low-cost acceptance in South Africa at the moment, but we still got to get there. But they've started coming down that pyramid by being able to put an MPOS solution, which is a lower cost device, into market. Still a long way to go. And ultimately, we've got to get to a point where how do we even strip out those devices? Because that's when you are able to solve for the street seller on the side of the road who's got 10 packets of knickknacks and 4 lollipops. And those are the kind of things that we should be able to pay for digitally, ultimately. You've got SnapScan and Zapper. Quite a lot of fragmentation has taken place in the industry there, but if you think what they've done around QR payments in the market and just driving an alternative payment stream, an alternative acceptance mechanism, typically all being led there in the last 5 years. And that's led to some of the numbers that were quoted by MasterCard in terms of the growth of acceptance points, around about 1.5, 1.6 million in the market. If you look where we were 5 years ago, we were probably just over 300, 400,000 acceptance points. So, that's being driven by those fintech innovations. If I look at our own world in terms of where I come from, what we did around deposit at till to create an interoperable solution in retail where a customer can go and get their money into the financial system. It's a world first. Visa and MasterCard have ultimately adapted their rules to accommodate that use case. But that was all driven by a fintech. Fintech drove the industry testing, obviously supported by a sponsoring bank. But these are innovations and solutions that have come to play. And if you think about CCPI, when the rules and the clearing rules were put together around that payment type, what we call deposit at till in the market wasn't even a use case that came into the ecosystem, or even was in the framework or reference when those rules were put together. So these are things where the industry can get advanced by fintechs, and then ultimately the ecosystem can only benefit from a holistic approach. It's not about fintech standing on one side. You do need all the players and all the participants in the market to play ball in order to roll these things out and scale. And that's ultimately where both the fintechs and the banks will prosper.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, but let's go. Gerard, I think, Andrew, if you could just line up. I have a view that we could have reached a threshold from 20 years ago when you built what you did and the internet was maturing. to where we are now. So I'm going to come back to you on that one. But Gerard?
Yeah, I think perhaps let's start with the definition of fintech. I have two quotes here. The one is Oxford Dictionary via Google says, it's computer programs and other technology used to support and enable banking and financial services. Fintech is one of the fastest growing areas for venture capitalists, and Wikipedia, where we all go to for knowledge, says firms using new technology to compete with traditional financial methods in the delivery of financial services. And the ABC of fintech is artificial intelligence, blockchain, cloud computing, and big data, right? So those are the things that are being said, and that's global. Andreessen Horowitz in 2011 wrote his seminal blog, Software is Eating the World, and that's really happened over the last, 13 years odd, that the world has grown and adopted software in all places, and it's changed. And fintechs helps accelerate that. Fintechs are the leading edge. We've heard we've not heard, we've seen and appreciated that MasterCard's coming into South Africa on soil. They're coming into the cloud. Our new PayShop system runs in AWS, right? That's cloud. Who would have thought 10 years ago banks would be running in public cloud? And that's because of fintech. So I think fintechs bring three things for us to the equation. The first thing is that validation of technology, right? And ultimately, the technology allows the banks to see something, look at it, learn about it, see it in action, and then adopt from there. Fintechs also, to Andrew's point, brings that competitive edge, the ability to compete and make a difference. And I think that, for me, is an important point to keep the competitive nature going and to help us. But the one thing that's frequently underlooked, and the one that I think in South Africa we've underlooked, from my perspective, is that fintech brings specialization. They bring knowledge. They bring a global perspective. It's sufficient for us as a software vendor that looks globally to write software multiple times across the world and sell it. I have an hypothesis that one of the reasons why PIPC was so successful is because they adopted the UK's open banking API. The software vendors and the technology providers were ready. When they launched it, they could go for it, right? So ultimately, we as specialists, and now in our case in security and authentication, can help educate, help make sure that the standards are there. So I think bring fintechs in earlier. We can help participate. We can help provide you with technologies that's easier to use and more cost-effective to the whole industry. What we've had in the case of the likes of a PayShop, where all the banks have the specs. There's only 3 fintechs in the whole country that has actually seen the specs. Okay? So and it was designed without fintech presence. And the use cases weren't validated necessarily by the fintechs. Now, that meant that all the banks had to go and custom build all of this stuff, hope it works. And I think those are the kind of challenges we can avoid by tapping into the knowledge of fintechs and the participation they can bring.
That's a topic all on its own I want to get to. Okay, Andrew, and then while you're going, I wanted you to line up for us, Gerard. Just a thought from my side. The data point this morning that was shared by our regulator was that there's a trust factor. So I want you to just talk about trust, because you're great at everything you've said. I don't doubt any of that. But there's a huge issue around trust that the banks have enjoyed for many, many centuries. Okay, Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, I think I agree with Gerard there in terms of, embracing the ecosystem early on, especially when it comes to solution designs at an industry level. I think it's critical because, it came up in some of the discussions from Tim and the Deputy Governor this morning around, feeling a little bit disappointed that maybe the PayShop numbers aren't where they need to be versus, other jurisdictions around the world. And I think, that those numbers are going to really accelerate when that ecosystem gets broadened. And we need to include the ecosystem. In other words, all the role players that have an appetite to play in that market early on, as opposed to where we probably end up finding ourselves when call it the non-banks get brought into the ecosystem, where there's going to be a whole lot of challenges, rules needing to be relooked, just because the use cases are going to be ultimately different to what's currently in the market.
Okay, 30 seconds.
I think your comment was around trust, and I think it's essential in all payment systems that there is trust. There's definitely trust that my money is at the bank. I think, and certainly in South Africa, we've seen, and some of the colloquial stories we've heard, is the person goes and says, well, my bank steals my money. He goes to the ATM and he gets available balance, I don't know, 300 Rand. He says, look, let me do it again. Available balance, 29 Rand. There's an educational element that comes with trust. And I think there's different forms of trust. Trust through how we work through in the environment by playing to the rules, by understanding I need to keep afloat, I need to have certain certifications and things in place. I think the consumer trust is different. They do trust something, but they also trust their friends and their social enablers. And I think that's where we need to potentially work on trust, because I think banks have that, fintechs have that too if they play it by the right rules.
Andrew, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to add anything at this stage. I think we should move on to the next topic.
All right. I want to line you up, though, to just some of the questions are coming through. A lot of focus on can fintechs help solve socioeconomic issues in the country? Big question, but an interesting one, and we'll come back to that one. So while we are moving on to the next question, also you can read it. I'm not going to read it out. I'm going to let Gerard go first, and he's got 3 minutes.
Great. So I think this... it's easy to blame the banks, I think, sometimes, right? They're the big guys, they're the incumbents, they have all the rights and all the privileges. But I've said a number of times that banks have it tough too, right? So ultimately, they have to comply to all these rules. They get really scrutinized. So it's not quite easy. And I don't think the banks is wrong to try to protect their turf and try to protect their competitive advantage. A fintech would too. Any business needs to protect their business. It's whether it's been unfair. Now, the next thing would be, well, if it isn't the banks that's hindered it, well, who else did it? Is it the regulator? And I think that's also a bit unfair. I think our regulator in South Africa is quite open to change, and I think it'll be a little bit difficult necessarily to put it all on them. I do think, though, the problem is a bit of a systemic one. It's a historic view on how you run these systems that's perhaps the case. And I want to maybe draw a parallel to the security industry and the community there. In the good old days, you did security through obscurity. Right? The VHS algorithms was proprietary, custom-made in little corners, dark recesses of the world, and nobody knew the algorithm, and nobody knew the keys. And eventually, it came out that all of those cryptography that was done in the dark recesses was actually not secure. It hadn't been peer-reviewed. It hasn't been shared. It hadn't been opened up. And I think security now is about sharing the information, right? When NIST looks at new cryptographic algorithms, it publishes it to the whole world. It has everybody reviewed. It has people testing it. It tries to break it. It sets incentives for that. And I think historically, we've tried to keep banking secure. A lot of the banking stuff is private, secure, not shared. I think it's time to open it up. It's time to share them for comment. And that's the modern trend. If you look at EMVCO, for free, I can download all of EMVCO's specs, right? For $900, I can contribute to and give inputs to the spec. And then I can pay to actually be there to write the specs. And there are no criteria except me wanting to participate and me having any interest. And I think, by creating an open environment, an open framework, we will have more participation, we will foster more collaboration, more understanding, right? I don't understand, for example, and sorry, I don't want to keep on picking on one example, why we started with P2P and not P2M in PayShop. There's probably a reason there. I don't think our fintechs know that, but those are the type of debates we could have had earlier on.
Sounds like there's an opportunity for a lunch on PayShop and how we could have done it better. But over to you, Andrew.
I'll pay.
Okay.
So I guess this question starts leading to some more controversial type answers. So I think you'll just appreciate where it's coming from. But I think one of the biggest challenges we have in the industry and just driving payments forward is just access. The frustration of a fintech trying to get stuff done, being reliant on essentially a handful of incumbents in the formal sector in terms of the banking space that will actually be willing to sponsor a fintech. It takes a hell of a lot of heavy lifting to just be able to get a product into the market. And I think that's really where the opportunity comes in terms of how do we embrace this and why. And the question also has got to be answered why would a bank embrace it? there needs to be an open ecosystem, and I think the industry, in terms of South Africa, we're making some significant strides in terms of opening the payment system up. The PASA and how that morphs into the PIB going forward, I think those are definitely steps in the right direction. You would have recently seen in the last, call it 3 years, the entrance in terms of the designated clearing participants coming to the fore. And those are positive, I think, positive moves from a regulatory space to allow those players into the market. However, what we are finding, even as a designated clearing participant coming into call it the inner core of the onion, as it's always referred to in PASA, is that the regulation hasn't necessarily changed with the opening up of the licensing system at a regulatory level. So yes, you can get licensed, yes, you can come into the inner core, but you still can't necessarily do what you need to be able to do as a fully fledged bank would to be able to operate in that space. And changes in the NPS Act and the COFI bill, which is the things that are being tabled at the moment, will definitely bring those enhancements that will essentially cast some of those players free. Now, why would you want to become a designated clearing participant? It's a lot of heavy lifting. One of the comments made to me by a banker, in fact, yesterday, one of the well-known people in the industry, was like, well, when is the fintechs going to actually start contributing to the payment space as opposed to just basically leveraging off the rails? Well, when you become a designated participant, that's when you start contributing. It's really heavy lifting. It's extremely expensive. You've got to have either very deep pockets or very forgiving shareholders. But it's actually a case of, at a point in time, as a fintech, you get to a point where you've actually got to try and control your own destiny as far as you can. And if you're not able to do that within the traditional sector, it's something you may consider of making that big move and getting vested. And the frameworks are now opening up to be able to do that. Just some of the things, just one quick last point. We keep hammering post-shop, but I think it's because it's something it gets brought up in every forum and every get-together that we have. But if you just think about what the PIB is trying to achieve in the market and what the industry is trying to do in terms of opening the payment ecosystem up, then we have something like payment post-shop landing right in the middle of this, which actually goes against what's the spirit of what's being achieved by the PIB and typically what's being driven by Vision 2025 at a SARB level, whereby people are now being excluded because you're not a bank. And so, we welcome the post-shop specs being released into the industry to some of the non-banks. I think
Point taken.
We can definitely
embargo
do something there.
I just want to stay with you there, Andrew, because some of the questions coming through are pretty much along the same lines. They're saying, well, why not with the regulatory framework shifting next year? Why would you, notwithstanding the barriers, there's an investment requirement, there's heavy lifting. Is it, given the hindrance, not better for fintechs to opt and leverage what the PIB promises and go ahead and license, operate? Why do you want to continue leveraging the bank? So why would that model have to coexist?
It definitely needs to coexist. I mean, even in the PIB structure, that's going to come with fees, so you committed financially right up front. I think for a fintech, in many cases, it starts with just a bright idea or a gap that's been identified in the market, but you don't really know where this thing's going to go and where you're going to be able to land. And to be able to do that heavy investment up front is very difficult unless you've got really deep pockets. So I think there's definitely the role there and the need to be able to collaborate. And in many cases, if you get into a deep partnership with a bank, they'll actually take you on that journey. And so that heavy lifting becomes half a heavy lift, and it doesn't become as resource dependent as having to go on your own. So, going on your own is not for the faint-hearted.
We know that.
I want to perhaps come in and just say, we sometimes make it sound like there's not people in the industry that wants to play. I happen to know for a fact there's a bunch of people in BankServe that would like more openness. And the whole PIB and the PASA organization and the work they've done to create this openness and inclusion is a case study in excellence, in participating, in keeping a community updated, in being open and interested. So there's incredibly positive signs of success and signs of an attitude towards this openness. It's a team sport, right? Payments, you can't do it on your own, right? We need interoperability. We know that brings this thing. So I think there's awareness being created in the industry, and I have a lot of positive. I'm positive about it, but I'm sometimes worried that we're moving a little bit too fast. We've now heard that Kofi's not going to make it because of various reasons, and I think that's our challenge: is how do we not get held back? I'm really excited about the likes of Efficacy and others starting to join and actually being active participants. It's great to see. So there's really some positive signs coming out and lots of sentiment towards that. Capitec Pay launched with more than 30 fintechs, Capitec Pay, right, participating. That's brilliant signs of collaboration. So I think there's some good signs too. It's not all doom and gloom.
Okay, so that's the symbiosis we were referring to. I think a lot of the questions are dealing with exactly that we're saying there are signs and there are examples and lots of good ones around collaboration and how we can work together. And the sponsored versus stand on your own dichotomy does not have to be a dichotomy. It means we're talking about how those two models can coexist in the new regulatory framework. I want to move to our next question. We're quickly running out of time, but I'm going to let you go, Andrew, and you have 3 minutes, and if you can bring it under, that would be great.
Yeah, I guess the biggest bugbear of any fintech is just the pace of the bank to get stuff done. I mean, if you think about it, I guess you can even relate it to our Springbok rugby team. If you're standing on that wing and you're waiting for that ball to come to you, you could be standing there all day and you might get the ball once in a rugby game. And if you take that the ball's actually only in play around about 28 to 30 minutes a game, that's a long day out when you're on the field for over 80 minutes. So the fintechs are very much in that same boat, often on the wing, waiting for that ball or something to happen so that they can move forward rapidly. And then I think that's where fintechs are also starting to evolve, and this is where things like the modernization of the payment system and all these things where fintechs can actually play a significant role. And that's really where you start seeing that wing now, the traditional way of a wing standing on the side of the field waiting for a ball has changed. And you now see a wing running in the middle of the field and getting hungry and getting involved in the game and looking for work to be done. And I think that's typically what and I bring that back to the fintech analogy, that's what typically fintechs are doing and doing more and more of, is actually getting involved and participating in a greater way. And that's where the ecosystem starts coming together. Just going back to just the speed of going to market. In a fintech, we analyze the risk, we analyze the business case, we see if the tech is possible, a decision gets made, and you go for it. In the banks, it typically ends up being 20 committees to jump through, and once you've got through those 20 committees, it's the committee of the committee to get the final approval, and then you can start playing. And these things are just things that it's sucking up resources, sucking up time that could probably be used a lot more effectively. Obviously, bearing in mind that there's quite a lot of silo behavior in a bank in terms of just resources looking after specific areas, whereas in the fintech, it's a case of you've got something that you need to achieve. It's roll up your sleeves and make it happen. And so your resourcing in that tends to be a lot more generalistically the way they approach things, and a more generalistic approach as opposed to, this is only the silo that I operate in. Due to unlimited funding, a fintech essentially can't afford to get things wrong. So as much as fintechs can be seen as mavericks and sometimes get some bad reputation as a result, a fintech cannot actually afford to get it wrong. They've got to get it right first time. If you make a mistake, it costs you dearly, and you might not even be able to recover from that. So you've got to get things right first time. Fintechs, as we all know, typically are nimble and flexible, but they've also got to be very much arrow-focused. And I think this is the value that a fintech can bring into the ecosystem, is a bank typically solves for many different things, whereas a fintech is focused on one specific thing. And being focused on one specific thing often can give you a great result. And obviously there's opportunities for the banks to leverage.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you there. Gerard, I want you to just focus a little bit in your answer to some of the tone that's coming through to say, Speed, yes, we get it. I don't know the bank with 20 committees you have to go through, but some of us probably work there. I just want to ask you, based on this question that has come through, it takes time for, notwithstanding the speed you need to work with, for legislation to land, for those changes to be felt in the environment. Despite, the agility you operate with as fintechs, is it feasible to suggest that maybe there's still another, call it reality to face, which is the fact that there's a power imbalance between fintechs and banks? Some of it, for me, emanates from the trust issue, which I still maintain is a big issue for fintechs. But is there possibly, and it's not bad power, good power imbalance that makes it more difficult, notwithstanding how agile you can be?
Sure. There's, I think for me, the real challenge of a fintech is if it doesn't work, it fails. Right? There's more than 1,000 fintechs applications for new funding every year. Only 10% of fintechs make it. So it's a very efficient market because the right idea and the right pattern can win. So for me, that's the big thing here. It's brutal out there for the fintechs, and that's where there might be 15 fintechs that has cool ideas, but the one that works and has market fits. It's a great way to find market fit through survival of the fittest. And banks, I think, can learn from that and adopt some of those patterns and see that. I think even, the bank that's outward looking and looking at fintechs can bring them into the fold, help mature them and take them on. But there's a ton of ideas, and that's, I think, one of the things that fintechs can bring to the market. So again, it comes to that collaboration, but that efficient market where the right idea out of 1,000 wins, not necessarily because they're smarter or better. There's 15 banks, there's 1,500 fintechs, and 10% of that will have a good idea. So.
Okay. I'm going to pace us up a bit and still also get the opportunity to look at our last question. But Andrew, something that comes through I think is quite useful to talk about, given speed versus when the environment settles in terms of regulatory changes, is a question around culture. And how do you think fintech culturally will have to change in terms of mode of operating, style, execution as well, given that you're going to scale up in this world?
Sure, that's a very difficult one to answer. I think our culture really boils down to leadership in any organization. So you take it at an organizational level, great leaders basically drive great cultures in organizations. And with that, if you're successfully driving that and you're succeeding, your reputation will follow you. But that goes across not just an organization, it goes across an industry, it goes across, call it fintechs as a conglomerate. And it's no different to a bank ultimately at the end of the day in terms of, what banks represent and the cultures in banks. Those are typically driven by the leadership in the organization and how things get done. And that can be led by both, inward and outward forces. So, are you embracing the ecosystem, or are you inward focused in terms of you only build and solve internally, or are you actually looking and embracing, call it the fintech community, to bring those solutions into the environment? And those cultures typically, where there's like-minded people get together, that's where business happens.
Okay. Gerard, can I ask you, based on the last question, and I want to pace us up, go off script a little bit to say, the question does have a leaning to suggesting that banks haven't done enough or around the underserved and underbanked, or certainly access to payments. And I'm hearing both of you say otherwise. You're saying that we've managed in great partnerships to achieve access to payment services. But maybe if you want to just close up for us, because we've got about 2 minutes left, and your last remark on this, and then over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question because, typically a fintech with scarce resources would go for the high margin business and leave the difficult cases for itself. But I think we've seen things like Shopify and other enable more people to have a merchant website and more people to participate in e-commerce, almost bringing that out. So I think there are two ways in which this can be done and should be focused. The one is potentially to set the fintech free and say, help that specific community, come innovate. Let us create an innovation forum, a place where we can incubate these ideas. potentially even, banks sponsor them in some way. The other one is to make it part of regulations, to say, well, if you want to play, if you want to have your license, you must make sure that you are accessible to these communities. I think having more discussion, understanding what we want to achieve and how we do that will again help us as fintechs to understand where the opportunity lies. Last point there, I think also, while a certain underserved community, let's say the blind or potentially others, might not be served well in a smaller community like South Africa, at a global perspective, there's a potential to serve them well. And potentially when you look at that and you draw it on its side, a global tech player in that space could actually help because they bring critical mass because they're not looking at South Africa. So I think there's various ways in which we can try to solve certain pockets, certain problems, and bring them together, either by focusing or not.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Andrew, last 44 seconds, and one other point that's come through is to say, do you want to coexist, or should banks just acquire fintechs and or have fintech divisions? Old question, but useful question for you to close out on.
I mean, I think the sum of the parts creates the whole. And, ultimately, you've got to collaborate. You've got to be able to collaborate in the market, and partnerships are key. I mean, even as a fintech, you can't do everything yourself. I think it goes the same in the banking space. If you think about the old way of doing things where you would pick a strategy and you'd just go ahead and go and do it and deliver into the market, there's too much competition, there's too much noise, there's too much disruption out there. And so you've actually got to embrace the opportunities in the market that fintechs bring. And by doing that, you can actually back several horses into the race. Some of them are going to fail, but hopefully you've packed enough horses in the race that you can actually have a success. And just having a part of the cake as opposed to trying to own the cake, the whole cake, will actually ultimately deliver to the bottom line and drive the ecosystem and the payment industry forward.
That's great. Our time is up. It has been a great panel. Thank you,
Thanks.
debate. And if anybody wants to connect afterwards, we're all available. So we look forward to chatting to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.